At ALLFIE, we've been speaking with solicitors to answer some of the questions around systemic barriers to inclusive education for disabled children and young people. In this video, we are joined by Lucy Atherton from Simpson Millar to discuss what is off-rolling and why is it illegal.
Hi, I'm Lucy Atherton. I'm a solicitor. I specialise in education and children's rights. I'm a senior associate at Simpson Millar, and I'm going to be talking today generally about the legal rights of children who've been off rolled or excluded. But anyone who's in this situation should seek legal advice on the specific facts of their own case.
What is off-rolling?
So, off rolling is where a pupil is removed from a school role without using a permanent exclusion, when that removal is primarily in the best interest of the school rather than in the interest of the child. And that includes pressuring a parent to remove their child from the school. Schools can formally remove pupils from the role if they've, for example, moved to a different area or a different school, or if they've been permanently excluded or have gone through a managed move. But off rolling is like an informal process.
Why is off-rolling illegal?
It's illegal because schools have requirements to follow certain processes if they want to take a child off the roll. And as I said, that could be if they were excluded or if they'd moved away from the area. So, as I said, off rolling is an informal process and it falls outside of the ways that schools are meant to deal with a child leaving the school or being removed from the school.
Why might schools resort to it?
So, unfortunately, some schools do pressure families to take their children out of school. That could be to avoid an exclusion. So that they might say to the parents, "Oh, your child, you don't want a permanent exclusion on your record." And schools might want to do this because then it won't be counted in their exclusion figures. So Ofsted and the DFE do look at the numbers of pupils that schools exclude, and schools know that it'll look bad if they're excluding lots and lots of pupils. So it's one way to kind of get around that. Um, that is a clear example of off rolling and it's never acceptable. And there's statutory guidance on exclusions that's available online if you just Google DFE statutory guidance on exclusions. Exclusions are meant to go through a robust process of checks and balances to make sure that they're justified, and avoiding this isn't fair on pupils or parents. Another reason that schools might off-roll pupils, and I think where it first started being looked at was just before exams, so kind of at the end of year 11 or towards the end of year 11, but before the GCSE results have been released, so that that pupil's results aren't included in the overall school statistics. Um, in order to try and make their exam results look better if they feel that this pupil is unlikely to do well in their exams. And again, that's obviously unlawful because it's not a good reason to remove a child from school.
What are parents' rights around this and how can they challenge off-rolling?
So the key thing to keep coming back to is that a child shouldn't be removed from a role unless there's a lawful reason to do so. So if a child has already been taken off the roll at the school and parents think that this was unlawful, they should report that to their local authority and also to Ofsted, and they should seek legal advice on whether they could get their child reinstated. That would depend on the facts of the case. If a school is pressuring parents to remove their child from the role, then parents should seek advice from a solicitor or an advice organisation such as IPSI, ideally before this has happened. So try and get in before you agree to anything with some advice on what your legal rights are. Parents should be aware that if they agree to electively home educate their child, they're not entitled to any support, including from the local authority. So, if they've been pressured into this, they should make clear to the local authority and the school that this isn't really elective home education. They didn't willingly agree to this, and so they do still want support with their child's education. It's also worth noting that under the UN Convention on Human Rights, all children have a right to an education. And this could be relevant if the child has been off rolled and nothing else has been put in place. So the local authority has failed to put any alternative education in place for that child because they might be being denied their right to an education.
What should the Department for Education and local authorities be doing to prevent schools from off rolling?
Over the last 5 years, I'd say, is since it kind of people became aware of this practice. And Ofsted has now specifically looks at off rolling as part of their inspections. So they look at the school role and essentially see if children are disappearing from the role without there being a clear explanation for why that's happening. In terms of local authorities, they have a duty to ensure that all children in their area receive full-time suitable education. So if they become aware that a school is unlawfully off-rolling pupils, they should raise that with the school, as well as providing education for those pupils in the interim if they don't have a school place at that point.
How can ALFIE use the courts to stop this?
Thinking in terms of if there was any like strategic litigation you could take to look at the wider issue rather than just individual cases, one thing to look out for would be if there are schools or academy chains which appear to be systematically off-rolling certain groups of pupils, such as disabled pupils. If you could show that there was a policy or a practice of off-rolling disabled pupils, for example, just towards the end of year 11, then this kid could give rise to a wider challenge about the practice or policy that was being put in place rather than just the case of that individual pupil.
What can parents do if they are feeling pressured into a situation like this? And what questions should they ask?
So I'd say there are three key things that parents should be asking schools if they think that they're being pushed into one of these situations. So, firstly, is the school suggesting that their child should be excluded? And if so, why? Because if they're saying that the child should be excluded, there's proper processes they should follow with that. And also, they need to justify the decision. So, first, ask that. And then, secondly, is the school suggesting that they can't meet that child's needs? So, say if it's a disabled child with an EHC plan, anything like that. Um, if so, if that's the reason that the school is giving, what steps has the school taken to make reasonable adjustments or obtain additional support to try and meet those needs before saying we're no longer able to support this child? And then finally, if the school is suggesting that the parents should home educate their child, this isn't so much a question, this is more of just a statement. But if the school is saying, oh, why don't you home educate them? I would always advise that the parents should say, we're not agreeing to that. It can only be elective home education, and we're not electing to this if it's not something that they want. So just be really clear throughout that if what the parents want is support through the school system and reasonable adjustments for any disability their child might have, then they're not saying we're going to take on responsibility for dealing with all of their education ourselves. As a final point, I'd just note that schools often raise concerns about pupils having an exclusion on their record. Like they'll say, oh, well, maybe it'd be better if you take them out of the school because then you won't have to have a permanent exclusion on their record. In relation to that, I'd say there is a reason why there are all these systems in place around exclusions from school, because schools need to be able to justify their decision to exclude any child, disabled or otherwise. And it's hard to see how the child gains any benefit from some kind of informal process where at the end of it they still end up out of school.